Hi guys, my name is Tiffany and welcome back to my channel. It is officially 2021, so I'm here to bring you another Upcycle by T-Toe, but I'm actually going to change it to Upcycle by Little Toe just to make things on my channel a little bit more cohesive. This video was meant to be posted over a week ago, but it's late because there was an unfortunate flooding incident in my apartment. So this is actually the second video in my Reformation-inspired velvet collection series. If you watched my first video, I made this dress and I'm gonna link that down below in case you guys wanna check that out. But in this video, I'm gonna show you how I turned this dress into this dress and also this velvet two-piece into this dress. And while I am so ready to leave 2020 behind, my goal for this velvet dress series was to recreate 6 dresses, and I really don't want to start 2021 without accomplishing this, so hopefully I'll have 2 more velvet dresses for you guys next week, but for right now, let's get on with the tutorial. The first dress I'm going to be recreating is the Reformation mountain dress. I made 2 midi-length dresses in my last video, so I didn't want the mini dresses to feel left out. The Reformation mountain dress retails for $248. It has a simple silhouette with a fitted bodice. It features 3/4 length sleeves with a double ruffle detail at the end of each sleeve. The skirt has a subtle flare and a lovely ruffled hem. The dress has a zipper closure in the middle of the back that doesn't go all the way to the top, but has a button closure on the top instead. Just like my last video, I'm going to be using another free pattern that's available on the Mood Fabrics website. I've chosen to use the pine dress pattern because it's pretty similar to the silhouette that I'm looking for, meaning that I won't have to make too many modifications. I'll include the link to this dress in the description box below. Once you submit your email, you'll be sent a printable version of the pattern. I then printed and started taping the pattern pieces together. Here are the pattern pieces after I had taped and cut them out. I won't be making any modifications to the top, so starting with the front bodice pattern, I trace out the pattern onto some parchment paper using the size 2 pattern as a guide. Make sure to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the bottom, side seam, armhole, shoulder seam, and collar, and then cut out the pattern. Moving on to the back bodice. Again, I trace out the pattern onto parchment paper. This time, I add a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around and then cut out the pattern. For the skirt, the only modification I'll be making to the original pattern is changing the length. Since my dress will have a ruffled hem, I won't need to use this section of the pattern. I measure 5.5 inches up from the original hem and draw out a new hemline. Then I copy the pattern onto parchment paper, making sure I trace the new hemline. Add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the hem, side seam, and top, and then cut. Repeat the same steps for the back skirt pattern piece, making the same adjustments to the hemline. This time, I add a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around and then cut. Here are my pattern pieces for the skirt, and here are my pattern pieces for the top. Now that the pattern is all cut out, let's take a quick look at the dress I'll be upcycling. This velvet dress was thrifted for $1 at my local Salvation Army. Really not much to say about it except that it pretty much resembles a circus tent that was made from a velvet potato sack. It's made out of a stretch velvet, which I now know that I don't like working with, but I've got a decent amount of fabric to work with, so let's move on to the game plan. The plan for this is pretty straightforward. From the front and back of this top section, I'll cut out both my bodice pieces. The center back will have an invisible zipper and a button closure on the top. From the front and back of this middle section, I'll cut out the pieces I need for the skirt. I'll use the entire bottom of the original dress to create the ruffled hem, and I'll use the fabric from the original sleeves, modifying them slightly to remake the new sleeves. And with whatever fabric I have left over, I'll use that for the double ruffle hem for the sleeves. Before I start taking the velvet dress apart, I'm actually going to cut out the pattern pieces I need for the bodice and the skirt on some Fusible interfacing. The velvet that I'm going to be using is a little difficult to use because it's so stretchy, so this interfacing just provides a little bit of stability to make things a little easier. I lay out my parchment paper pattern pieces onto the Fusible interfacing and cut out all the pieces I need with my rotary cutter. Before I iron on the interfacing and cut out the pieces that I need, I'm going to seam rip the sleeves and save them for later. I'm also going to cut off the bottom section of this dress because I'm going to use it to create the ruffled hem of the mountain dress. As you can see here, I've seam ripped the sleeves and now I'll cut off the fabric I need for the ruffled hem. From the original hem of the dress, I measure 4 inches and cut the fabric using my rotary cutter, working my way around the entire hem of the dress. This is what I will use to create the ruffled hem for the mountain dress. I ironed on the Fusible interfacing onto the velvet and cut out my front bodice piece, 2 back bodice pieces, the front skirt piece, and the 2 back skirt pieces. Before I move on, I wanted to quickly mention that I actually trimmed off the 1/2-inch seam allowance from the neckline of the front and back pieces. While I was seam ripping the original dress, I decided to hold on to this piece, and I know you can't really tell what this is right now, but it was the binding that covered the raw edge of the neckline, so I'm going to reuse this to cover the neckline of my dress. Now I'm just going to transfer the darts onto my fabric and then sew all of the darts for the top and the skirt. As you can see here, I've transferred my darts from the pattern to my front bodice piece, and I'm using pins to mark them. To sew the dart, you're going to sew from the wide end to the pointy end. But when you get to the end, you're not going to backstitch. Instead of backstitching, I'm just going to take these 2 loose threads and I'm going to make 2 knots. Now I'm just going to snip off the excess thread. This step just ensures that the pointy end of your dart is not too bulky. Here is my front bodice piece with all the darts sewn. I've also sewn the darts on the back bodice pieces, and I'm going to place it on the front bodice piece right sides facing. Sew the side seams and shoulder seams with a straight stitch. I'll attach an invisible zipper to the center back, making sure it only comes up to this point. This part of the top will be left open. I've also sewn all the darts on my skirt pieces, and I'm now placing them right sides facing, and I'll join them together by sewing the side seams. I'll sew this bottom section shut, and I'll attach the rest of the invisible zipper to this section. Here is the top on. I've also installed the invisible zipper in the back. I'm actually pretty happy with the way this fits me. It is a little bit big, so I think I'm going to take in the side seams about 3/4 of an inch on either side, and then I'm also going to adjust the width of the skirt so that all the seams line up nicely when I sew them together. I went ahead and made all those adjustments, and here I have the top and skirt pinned together, making sure all of the seams and darts line up. I also cut my finger with my rotary cutter, so make sure you're really careful because those things are sharp. Once I've sewn these 2 pieces together, I'll attach the zipper to the skirt section as well. With my top and skirt pieces attached and the zipper fully installed, this is what my dress looks like now. I'm folding this top section of the center back about 1/2 inch on either side and sew with a straight stitch to hide the raw edge. As you can see here, I've gone ahead and sewn those raw edges under, and now using this elastic cord, I'm going to sew a little loop that I'll use as my button closure on this top section of my dress. This is what the elastic loop should look like. Using the neckline binding that I saved from the original dress, I'm going to cover the raw edges of the neckline of my dress. I attached it the same way I would attach bias tape, and here is what the neckline looks like now. Last step is to hand sew this button on the top here. I've gone ahead and sewn the button on. Now it's time to add the ruffled hem on the dress. This is the strip of fabric I cut from the original hem of the dress earlier. Now I'm just going to sew a basting stitch to create the gathers. I've pinned the ruffled hem to the dress, and I'll sew them together with a straight stitch. The ruffled hem is done, so now the last step is to attach the sleeves. I want to quickly apologize for the video quality for this neck section. I'm not quite sure what happened, but it's not the best, so I'm sorry. Here is the sleeve from the original dress. I measure and cut 2 3.5-inch strips from the bottom section of the sleeve. Then I cut out about 1 inch from either side of the sleeve. I want this top section to be gathered, so I'll sew a basting stitch from here to here. Moving on. Now taking both 3.5-inch strips I cut out earlier, I square off the edges and I'll sew these 2 pieces together to create a longer strip. Here is what it looks like after I've joined them together. Now using some scrap fabric that I had from the dress, I cut out a 2.5-inch strip. I'll trim the strip to match the length of the 3.5-inch strip, and I'll sew these together along the top to create my double layer ruffle. I've gathered the ruffle layer so it matches the length of the bottom of my sleeve, and I'll sew them together with a straight stitch. This is what it looks like sewn together. Now fold your sleeves right sides facing and sew along this seam. Pin and sew the sleeve to your dress, and you should have something that looks like this. Repeat all these steps for the other sleeve, and there you have your completed mountain dress. I actually made this dress as a Christmas gift for my friend Ilda, so here she is opening it now.
You made me a dress!
Of course, I made her put it on right away, and while she's being the most stunning model, here is a little refresher on what the original dress looked like. I think it's really similar to the Reformation mountain dress, and I am so happy with how this turned out, and even happier that it fits her perfectly. The second dress I'm going to be making in this video is the Reformation Roo Dress. I'm going to modify the pattern that I used for the mountain dress to make this Roo dress, but first let's take a quick look at the details. The Reformation Roo dress retails for $298. It has a beautiful off-the-shoulder ruffle neckline that I absolutely adore. It also features a midi-length skirt with a ruffle hem. The back of the dress is very similar to the front and is fitted but relaxed. Let's take a quick look at the original outfit. While I normally love a matching set, this very large two-piece velvet outfit definitely needs a makeover. It is made out of a stretch velvet, which moving forward I will probably avoid for a really long time. The top has this ruche detail down the center front, and the pants have an elasticized waist. Moving on to the game plan. From the front of the top, I'll cut out my back piece that will look something like this and will be joined by a seam in the center back. From the back piece of the original top, I'll cut out my front top piece. From whatever fabric I have left over from the top, I'll cut and join strips of fabric that will become the off-the-shoulder ruffles. I'll be using the pants to make the midi skirt, but I'll be flipping it so that the bottom of the pants becomes the top of the skirt and the top of the pants become the bottom of the skirt. I'll use one pant leg to create the front of the skirt, and I'll use the other pant leg for the back of the skirt. The original side seam of the pants will create a seam that goes down the center of both my skirt pieces. With whatever fabric I have left over, I'll use it to make the ruffled hem of the dress. As I mentioned a little earlier, I'll be using the same pattern as before, but I'll be making some modifications. Here is the parchment paper pattern piece that I used earlier for the front of the mountain dress. I'm measuring 13 inches from the bottom and drawing a horizontal line across the top. I won't be sewing this dart along the waist, so I'll straighten out this bottom line as well. Fold along both lines, and this is the new pattern I'll be using for the front bodice. The modifications for the back are pretty similar. I measure 11 inches from the bottom and draw a horizontal line across the top. Again, I won't be sewing this dart along the waist, so I straighten out the line. The back was looking a little low to me, so I decided to add 3/4 of an inch to that top line just to be safe. Fold along both lines, and here are the pattern pieces I'll be using to create the top of the Roo dress. Here is the back piece of the original top. I start out by folding it in half. Using the pattern that I modified for the front bodice, I pin it to my fabric and cut out the pieces I need, making sure I leave a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the top and bottom. Unfold the fabric and you should have a symmetrical front bodice piece that looks like this. Using one of the front pieces from the original top, I cut out one back bodice piece following the same steps as before, making sure to leave a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the top and bottom. Now using the piece that I just cut out, I place it right side spacing on my second piece from the front of the original top and cut out a symmetrical piece. Here are both of my back pieces for the top of the dress. I'm about to sew my top pieces together, but before that, I've transferred the darts from the pattern to my fabric. As you can see here, I've only pinned the darts for the bust. I won't be sewing the darts for the waist on the front or the back since the waistband will be elasticized. Now I've just pinned my front and back pieces of my top together, and I'm going to secure with a straight stitch. Here is what the top looks like now. Next, I'm going to hem this section of the underarm by folding it over once and sewing down with a straight stitch. Then I'll repeat on the other side. Now that I've hemmed the underarms, I'm going to add elastic to this front section of the top. I'm using 1/2 inch wide elastic. I'll cut the elastic about 1 inch shorter than the width of the top section and secure it with a zigzag stitch. As you can see here, I've already sewn on the elastic to the top of the front piece, so let's move on to the ruffles. From the leftover fabric from the top and from one of the sleeves, I cut out 4-inch strips of fabric that I'll sew together to form a long loop. I'm going to be sewing the ruffled part in sections because I'm already happy with the width of this top front section that we just elasticized, so I'm going to sew on the ruffled part here first. Here is the long loop from sewing the 4-inch strips of fabric together. I've also hemmed the top and bottom of this loop. Since I'm sewing the ruffles in sections, I'm using pins as landmarks. I'll line this green pin up to the center of the front and this pink one to the center of the back so that there's an equal amount of ruffles on either side. I'm also going to sew a basting stitch from this pin to this one to create the ruffles in the front. I've sewn the basting stitch and now I'm just going to pull the bottom thread, creating the ruffles until the length of the ruffle section matches the length of the elasticized section of the front of the top. Now I'm going to lay the ruffles onto the top, lining it up so that the basting stitch is on top of the 1/2 inch elastic and sew to secure, making sure the green pin lines up with the center front. I've sewn the ruffle section to the front and now I'll sew the back part of the loop to the back part of the top. I line the pink pin up to the center back and I place the top onto the loop, making sure the top edge of the back bodice lines up with the middle of this loop section. I'll sew this together with a straight stitch. I've just sewn the back pieces together and here is what the top looks like now. I'm going to use some twill tape to create a channel for my elastic that goes along the length of the loop that hasn't yet been ruffled. I'm going to place my twill tape in the center and sew along the top and the bottom, starting from this point and ending at this point. As you can see here, I've sewn along the top and bottom of the twill tape to create a channel, starting from this point, working my way around the loop to the other side of the top. Now from this point, I'll insert my 1/4 inch elastic that I've attached to a safety pin into the channel. Before I continue, I'm going to safety pin the other end of the elastic to the top so it doesn't accidentally go all the way through the channel. It took a little bit of time for me to work the safety pin through the channel, but once you get to the other side, you should have something that looks like this. Now sew these two ends where the elastic is sticking out with a straight stitch to secure it in place. I have the top on and I'm pretty happy with the way that it fits overall, so I'm gonna move on to the skirt. I've seam ripped my pants apart and this is one of the pant legs. This top layer is the front of the pant leg, this is the back of the pant leg, and this is the side seam. I'm just smoothing out both layers of the fabric so everything lays nice and flat. Like I mentioned earlier in the game plan, I'll be using the bottom of the pants for the top of the skirt since it's so narrow, so I'm gonna go ahead and cut off this hemmed section with my rotary cutter. Now from the new waistline, I measure and mark it 28 inches and then cut with my rotary cutter. Then, starting with the bottom piece, I use my ruler to straighten out this line and trim the excess fabric. I do the same with the top layer. Initially, I was going to use this whole piece as the front of my skirt, but because the bottom layer is slightly bigger than the top layer, I decided to go ahead and use this for the right side of my skirt. Now, I'm repeating all of the steps to the other pant leg to cut out a symmetrical piece that will become the left side of my skirt. Here are both my skirt pieces. I'll sew the bottom layer together, creating the center back seam, and the top layer together, creating the center front seam. I've gone ahead and sewn the skirt pieces together, and now I just need to add the ruffled edge to the hem. To do that, I'm basically going to do the same thing that I did to get this ruffled edge. From whatever fabric I have left over, I'm going to cut out a few strips to create one long piece that I'm going to use for the ruffled hem. I've gone ahead and sewn all those pieces together, and now I have this really long tube. Honestly, I don't even know how I'm going to show this to you. I don't think it's going to fit in frame because it is so long. I want to say it's 3 times the length of the hem of the original skirt. Anyway, I've hemmed one side of it so I don't have to do this later, and I've also sewn a basting stitch on the other side so that I can create the gathers. I've pinned the ruffled hem to the skirt, and now I'm going to sew with a straight stitch. I've just finished sewing the ruffles onto the bottom of the skirt, and it is a little more ruffly than I intended, but I don't hate it, so now I'm going to attach the skirt to the top. I've pinned my top and my skirt together, and it's not super clear visually, but I've pinned them so that the seam allowance for the top will be 3/4 of an inch, but the seam allowance for the skirt will only be 1/4 of an inch. Now I'm going to sew these together with a straight stitch. I've sewn the top and the skirt together, making sure that the seam allowance for the top is wider than the seam allowance for the skirt. I'll be creating a channel for my elastic using the seam allowance of the top, so starting from this point, I'm going to sew a straight stitch 1/2 inch above the seam that joins the top and the skirt, working my way around the waist until this point, leaving a small 1-inch hole so I can insert my elastic. I've sewn the straight stitch to create my casing, and now I'll insert my 1/2 inch elastic that I have attached to a safety pin. Work the safety pin through the casing until you reach the other side. Overlap the 2 ends of the elastic and sew them together with a zigzag stitch. Even out the fabric around the elastic, and the last step is to sew the 1-inch hole shut with a straight stitch. Here's what the dress looks like on. I love this neckline and I think it's so flattering. I can't believe this used to be pants and a top because I think it turned out pretty similar to the Reformation Roo dress and it wasn't too difficult to recreate. The only thing I left out was the waist tie, mostly because I didn't have enough fabric. Let me know what you think about this recreation. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and if you want to see more pictures of the dresses that I made today, make sure to follow me on Instagram at Little Toe. If you liked this video, make sure to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'm really hoping that 2021 is a better year for everyone, and as always, thank you so much for watching.